This is a read-through of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. There are 4 chapters in the Yoga Sutras. This is the translation by Michael Beloved, and I'm just going to read it verse by verse. This first video will be the first chapter, and so on. And so I'm not going to say any of the Sanskrit words. I'm just going to read it in English all the way through, and there will be a pause, just a brief pause, so that you can distinguish in between verses. Chapter 1, Samadhi Padha, Transcendence Accomplishment. Now Sri Patanjali gave the explanation of yoga and its practice. Yoga is accomplished when, as a yogin, you can stop the creative urges of your mind and emotions. Then you can become familiar with your bare self. But otherwise, whatever you do is regulated by the urges. There are 5 types of those creative urges. Each type has troublesome and non-troublesome interactions. The 5 types are experienced when you gauge external things correctly, when you gauge them incorrectly, when you imagine anything, when you sleep, and when you experience memory. Your correct assessments occur by accurate sense perception, by efficient analysis, or by using a reliable reference. When you gauge something incorrectly, that occurs through false information or by mistaking one factor for something else. When you hear of something or read of it, ideas concerning it usually form. When these concepts misrepresent the actual thing, that misconception is imagination. Sleep is that creative urge which operates without your awareness. Memory operates anytime you visualize something which was experienced before. By not having an interest in the mental ideas and emotional feelings, you may develop the power to stop their influence. You should persistently cultivate that lack of interest. However, you should be reverential in the practice, and it must be sustained for a long time. Note well that the lack of interest in one's own ideas and emotions is achieved only by one who has mastery over his psychological nature. Such a person would not crave things mundane, which are perceived by his own senses or which is heard of by his own ears. Please realize that the required lack of interest is exhibited when one attains a resistance to urges, which usually compel one to fulfill mundane desires. That lack of interest results in the development of a thorough awareness of the spiritual self. At first, after you develop that lack of interest, you will notice that your attention becomes linked to higher psychological states, but there will still be some analysis, reflection, inner joy, and focus on self-consciousness. Periodically, and with good luck, you will experience the transcendence in which the memory of things mundane seems not to exist at all. That will give you a glimpse of the status of the released souls who are diffused into the subtle material nature requiring no gross existence, and those divine beings who exist without a subtle or supersubtle material body. Their mind and emotion does not comprise of subtle energies of material nature. Since you have neither the diffused status nor the divine one, and since you still have a fixation with the memory of things mundane, your success in cultivating the required lack of interest hinges on confidence in what Sri Patanjali recommends. You would be required to have stamina. You should train yourself to retain any transcendental experiences, even the slightest. You should study this text so as to recognize the characteristics of samadhi, which is continuous and spontaneous contact between your attention and something or some energy which is beyond your normal range of perception. By this, a profound insight will develop in your psyche. Know with certainty that those of you who practice forcefully in a very intense way will be masterful yogis in the near future. But not everyone can apply themselves with intensity. One person might be mediocre, another might practice infrequently. There is a special method to be mentioned. That is the profound religious meditation upon the Supreme Lord. This person is that special individual who is not affected by troubles, actions, developments, or by subconscious motivations which are based on the urgings of subtle material nature. He is, for all practical purposes, the ultimate knower. He is the most experienced person. This God, being unconditioned by time, is the teacher even of the ancient masters of yoga, the pioneers of the process of release. The teachers before me designated the sacred symbol Om as being related to him. Many ancient teachers constantly repeated and murmured Om for realizing its effects and meaning. Thus, when uttered correctly, one's sense energy develops the urge to turn away from objects outside of one's material body. The sense energy then seeks psychological inner objects. Thus, the extrovert tendency, which is an obstacle to progress, is greatly decreased. The obstacles to the practice of yoga are physical and mental diseases, idleness, doubts about the power of the practice, inattentiveness while practicing, lack of energy to invest in an intense practice, proneness to sensuality in terms of always being drawn to forms in this world, mistaken views due to the inability to sidestep cultural activities, and scattered mental and emotional energy, which is due to being influenced by the subtle material energy. It would be necessary to remove the tendency for distracted states of mind. These come about by distress, depression, nervousness, and labored breathing, all of which are triggered by impulsive emotional states. To remove any of these obstacles, one should practice a standard method, which was effective for a more advanced yogi and which he recommends. When the obstacles to the practice of yoga temporarily subside, or when they are removed altogether, an abstract meditation ensues. In that state, the creative urges disappear. This is directly related to the successful cultivation of friendliness, compassion, cheerfulness, and non-responsiveness to happiness, distress, virtue, and vices. That abstract meditation may be caused by practicing a method of breath manipulation, wherein the vital energy of the gross and subtle body is enhanced, causing the creative urges to subside so that the higher nature is experienced. One may attain fusion to higher states or steadiness of mind by directing the mind towards a supernatural or spiritual object. Such an object would be just as real and objective as a physical one. That may be achieved by attaining sorrowless and spiritually luminous states. One may attain superconsciousness by linking one's attention to a person who is without craving. In some cases, superconsciousness may occur after one takes recourse to dream experiences or to dreamless sleep. It may be achieved by a spontaneous linkage of the attention to a higher concentration force or person which was dearly desired. The mastery over the functions and movements of the urges results in the control of one's relationship to the smallest portions of energy or to the largest conglomerations. For the great reduction of the urges in your mind and emotions, one has to sort between the perceiver in the mind, the flow of ideas or images, which are perceived by him, and the objects from which the perception originated. This is similar to knowing the status of a transparent jewel, the light which it absorbs from a colorful source, and that colorful source itself. In that comparison, the perceiver is like the jewel. His ideas and images are like the colored light which is reflected in the jewel. Even in ordinary usage of consciousness, one may deliberately link one's self, one's attention, to a higher concentration force by a careful observation of how the mind-attention mechanism operates when a word, its meaning, and the knowledge of the object alternate within the mind, blending, as it were, with one of those facets permeating with the other. Even though analysis is useful in material existence, it does not serve the purpose in higher yoga practice. In fact, such analysis is discarded completely in the highest stages. When the memory is completely purified, where it no longer reminds the self to pursue vices, and when the inquiring, inquisitive nature appears as it were, then the higher concentration forces and the divine personalities are experienced objectively. Just a few more verses here. One may investigate very subtle objects after dropping the usual analysis and after mastering the linkage of the attention as stated before. But the insight gained by that mystic research terminates. When one becomes linked to the higher concentration force, which has no gross characteristics and which is not directly linked to a gross object. Initially, all of this is motivated by the creative urges, in the sense that they caused the inquiring tendency in the first place. Thus, the previous descriptions were of higher experiences which were, to a degree, motivated because the spirit made contact with the creative urges of the mental and emotional energies. In the advanced states, however, those urges lose their hold on the self. Thus, that self is no longer motivated by them and no longer reacts to them, either for fulfilling the urges or for becoming indifferent to them. Thus, the motivations come from the Supreme Soul to whom the limited soul becomes linked. That association brings on clarity and serenity. There, with that competence, the yogi develops the reality perceptive insight, which is so natural to the Supreme Soul and which the limited soul develops in the Supreme Association. This is different to the normal perception, which is based on what is heard of, what is reasoned out in the material world, since that limited perception is restricted to a partial aspect of an object and never does it reveal comprehensively. Once the association of Supreme Soul is repeatedly attained, the impressions of that contact which forms in the mind acts as the preventer of the other impressions which used to contravene yoga practices. When there is linkage of the attention to the higher concentration force, there must be effortless and continuous, not with effort and not momentarily. There must be effortless and continuous linkage. When it is like that, it is considered to be samadhi, the highest stage of yoga. In that state, there is a complete departure from the memory, so its power of reminding the self of its contents is nullified completely. The self then becomes freed. So that was the first part of the Yoga Sutras, Samadhi Padha, Transcendence Accomplishment. If you would like to read the commentary and see the Sanskrit transliteration, you can also find this in the same book by Michael Beloved. Thanks for listening.